Welcome back to What Should I Use? I'm Jake Bruton, and today we're going to talk cladding, meaning the thing that we clad the outside of the building that's not the roof. Let's do it now. What Should I Use? A Build Original series hosted by me, Jake Bruton. Today's episode is sponsored by Allura Siding. So when we talk cladding, cladding is hyper-local. I realize that there are lots of things that are nationwide. There are products that are nationwide, but there are also things that are very much only the Northeast or very much the South or very much only the Southwest. So it is important that we address things from that standpoint as well as aesthetics and durability. So let's just real quick, I had a conversation recently with a client and she said, how do we keep this cedar deck from going back to being gray? If I lived in the Northeast, the conversation would have been, how quickly can we make these cedar shakes go from this nice cedar color to gray? So we have to understand that while all of these conversations are easy for me to have here in a national or potentially global platform online, the conversation is not necessarily the conversation that takes place in your market for your client. So especially when I start talking about aesthetics, that's a you thing, that's a your architect thing, that's a your company thing. And so that challenge is for you and your team. I'm going to talk first about what the IRC 21 says, then we're going to talk about Industry Council, then we'll talk about my experience. Let's get into it now. So even though we're going to start this conversation with the IRC, it is important to note that this decision-making process is not exclusive to just code, to just durability, to just what I've had success with from a warranty standpoint in the past. I, for the first time in this series, am going to explicitly say aesthetics is a big part of this conversation. And while I can't impart upon you what aesthetics work for your building, for what style is for your building, or for what your clients or your architect might think is appropriate for the setting in which you're building, that is part of the conversation here. And I think that it's important for me to not leave that to the very end. It's important for you to find a partner in this system, in this setting, that is from the beginning part of the design. And we tend to forget that as builders sometimes. We tend to go, okay, what's going to work from a is it going to fall apart standpoint, or what's going to work from the is the building inspector going to allow me to put that on the building standpoint? And sometimes we have a tendency to forget that the thing has to be beautiful and that our clients have to be happy with it long term from an aesthetic standpoint, rather than just like, if it rains, is water going to get in, or is it going to be energy efficient? And I have a tendency sometimes to forget that as well, that someone's going to live here and I want them to be in love with it from an aesthetic standpoint as well as a energy efficiency, health, and comfort standpoint. So I think it's important that I not forget that before we dive into, excitingly, what the code book says. So when we talk about IRC again, we're back to 703. This is very similar to when we talk about the WRB conversation. There is a ton of guidance. This is like the flip side to the WRB conversation. If we look at 703, it starts with allowable materials. We get veneer brick, we get stone, we get masonry, we get fiber cement like Allura, today's sponsor of the episode. We get aluminum and vinyl siding, but we also get vinyl siding from an insulated vinyl siding standpoint. We get steel, wood. There's so many different aspects to this. They don't give you this type of vinyl siding is allowable. They don't give you this kind of aluminum siding is allowable. They give you, if you're going to use vinyl, this is how it would need to be attached. And this is another one of those times where it is the code recognizes that this type of material is made and it's going to be installed, but at the same time, it kind of ends the attachment section or the use section with, and it's per manufacturer's recommendation. But there are a lot of really great guidelines in this section, because when we start looking at stone or wood or even some of the off-brand fiber cement and things like that, there's a good point where you can just come to this section of the code and find out how to install these things. When we talk about anchorage, we have frequency, we have length and diameter and materials. The code even says at this point, which is less important to the manufacturer than it is for like a let's keep this from falling off the wall standpoint. We're going to use aluminum fasteners, galvanized, stainless steel, rust preventative, or manufacturers approved. So then we get into this, like we have to do this the way that a manufacturer says is okay. And I think it's important for us to note that the code always kind of comes back to this thing where it's like, we have a standard. We know that this can work for wind loads that are 30 pounds per square foot of wind pressure on your soffit or your siding in your design pressure zone. Or we know that the manufacturer says it has to be done this way. And it's important to note that the code recognizes that the manufacturer knows more about their specific design product than necessarily the code in general knows about one specific type of product. And I think that it's super important to understand that the code is a starting point, but the manufacturer's installation instructions are going to supersede anything that's in the code, and having that on site and those instructions on site for both your installers and the code official are going to be important at this aspect. Penetration is another thing that's important here. We'll get into that in a second when we start talking about Rainscreen and how all of a sudden the cladding is not tight to our substrate, it's not tight to our structural sheathing, so therefore the cladding is further away from potentially the thing that it's supposed to be anchored to, and so length of fastener that the manufacturer might specify might not actually be the length of fastener that you need to be fastening with. And so we have to be aware of what we're doing and the changes that we've made to our assembly. Also, as with pretty much every section of the code, when we're not talking just regular old framing members, we're talking about ASTM standards, wind loads, and manufacturer recommendations that kind of wrap everything up and put it into a nice and tidy package. I think the beauty of this section of the code book, though, is the breadth of building materials that are allowable in this section. I can't think of a single thing that I've put on the outside of a building that isn't specifically addressed by name in this section of the code book. There are tons of different claddings. There are a ton of different ways to skin a building in this case. And the code really just goes, yeah, we're okay with all of them. So once we move beyond the cladding section of the code, and I know we're cheating the rules here, we're still talking code, but we're not talking cladding now, because I think the cladding conversation is more complicated than just cladding. By that, I mean cladding is doing a specific job for our building, right? Cladding is there to protect our enclosure. Protecting our enclosure is kind of the most important part of the entire system here. I made the argument that this is purely here to protect our WRB, right? I have a building that is probably waterproof and airtight before I put my cladding on. My cladding is there for UV resistance and to limit the exposure to water. So if I can stop the majority of the water from hitting the building, and I can stop the overwhelming majority of UV from hitting the building, then I can protect this layer, my last layer of defense, and now I can pretend as if over time this outer layer, this cladding layer, is in a sense some sort of sacrificial layer. Now I'm not talking sacrificial as in it's going to have to be replaced all the time, but it is my first layer of defense. First layer of defense that happens to be beautiful. How about that? So we also, in the cladding episode, should talk about how the WRB or the Rainscreen is addressed in this conversation. So go back and watch the episode on WRBs, but let's talk Rainscreen in the code book. It's really not addressed that much in the code book. There's kind of only one or two spots that it's addressed, but there are two things that I want to talk about in the code book. One, in the 2021 RRC, it's 703.7.3.2. Yes, I pulled that out of thin air, I remember it. It's basically moist or marine climate, meaning tons of damp, rainy weather. We need 3/16 at least outside of our water resistive barrier of drainage plane. That's uninterrupted space for water to run and not be held in tension between our cladding and our WRB. That drying potential, or that drainage plane between the two, is pretty much the only place that's recognized in the code that we're required to have that. There are some other spots in the code where having it lets us do different things with our assembly. We get away with different things. We can reduce our vapor barrier maybe. This is the only spot that the IRC recognizes that we have something of an advantage here, or that we're required to have it, and it's that moist and marine climate. So not everywhere, but I live in climate zone 4A. It rains in my climate. I was at a neighbor's house the other day and he said, "Man, I have this really beautiful redwood siding, but it's starting to rot." And I said, "Yeah, because it's not supposed to have the gutters dumping out up against it and then these bushes rubbing up against it." Well, his gutters and those bushes and the mulch that's up against the siding create a moist marine climate, and now he has a siding that is experiencing something that is nowhere near climate zone 4A. So we have the ability to create things that can cause problems as if we live in different climates if we're not taking care of the building. There are arguments that, depending on what time of the year it is, depending on what weather's happening at the moment, we're getting the effects that other climate zones and other places, other locations get and see any day of the week. And so I think that we can look at this section of the code and apply our thoughts from other sections quite easily. I sat through a presentation a couple years ago in which Dr. John Straub of Waterloo University presented some very compelling evidence that 1/8 of an inch is actually enough to get that capillary break. So when I mentioned our IRC code about marine climates a second ago, and we talked about that needed 3/16 of an inch, technically that's a 1/16 more than what you need if you just need drainage. So if you need that water to free flow out of the wall, 1/8 of an inch is now considered to be sufficient. And when we talk about that, free flowing out of the wall is fantastic. If you've read The Builder's Guide to Cold Climate, Joe Stieberg's book, that is one of the best resources for managing water and dealing with this. And when we're talking about cladding and protecting our building and protecting our walls, Joe's book, and there's one diagram in that book that captures absolutely everything. If we can keep it away from the wall, and if it does get in the wall, we drain and we dry, that's amazing. Well, if you're paying close attention, when I talk about 1/8 of an inch, we only talked about draining, but we want draining and drying. So we go straight back to the model building code in Canada, and we go to 2010, and the entire model building code in Canada since 2010 has been 10 millimeters. And for those of you that are amazing at conversions, that's 3/8 of an inch. So for my purposes, we can either go with a 3/8 batten strip, or we can go with a 3/8 matrix, or some version of those things. And we now have the ability to have a capillary break, so we're not having water held in tension, and we have enough space to create a convective loop as long as we have opening top and bottom of the wall. And so now we have draining and drying. So no water held in tension and drying potential. Those are the things that I'm looking for when we're trying to create longevity and to mitigate the effect that the water can have on our cladding and our enclosure. And that's our whole goal here, right? If we're trying to stop the water from affecting our WRB and our enclosure, we're going to stop as much as we can from getting to the wall, we're going to stop it from being held in tension, and we're going to eliminate the risk of it being held there once it gets there. It's important to note as well in the IRC and in the model building code in Canada that they do actually address flashings. I think the model building code in Canada actually has a better take on this than the Americans, but we can just talk about the idea of a head flashing or a flashing on anything that actually penetrates the wall. That flashing, because once we start adding a WRB, for some reason our brains explode, needs to go all the way back to the WRB. So if you think about something has gotten past our cladding, past our siding, it's gotten all the way to our WRB, it's running down the wall, we want it to kick out and be on the outside of our cladding. So we're trying to get everything away from the building as soon as possible. Every flashing goes all the way back to the WRB, it gets detailed to the WRB, and then it kicks all the way to the outside. That's how my brain thinks about it. That's actually how both the IRC and the Model Building Code address it. So that's one thing that I feel like it comes up every time we talk about flashings and WRBs and rain screens. It's a question that every carpenter I've taught about rain screens has, and they always go, well, does it just tape to the WRB? Does it tape to the batten strips? Where does it go? There's your code. There's the cladding. We do have industry associations like RAINA, the Rainscreen in North American Association. There are nonprofit groups that are involved in this, but there aren't really any large industry groups that are guiding how things are developed or what's happening in this. So I think we're going to just kind of push that to the side at the moment, and we'll go straight to my take on things. So when we start talking about it, there is the aesthetic thing that I've talked about multiple times, and I realize that I always drive home the conversation about availability. I'm going to really push, though, when it comes to cladding, that we have not only a local salesperson, someone that I can pick up to the phone and go, hey, I need someone to come out to the job site and answer these 3, how do we put this together questions. But I also really enjoy the support at the local lumberyard. When it comes to products like Allura or something similar, I have a guy at my local lumberyard that I can walk in and sit at his desk and go, hey Gary, his name is actually Gary, and go, hey, I know you've sold this to 50 other people in the last 3 weeks. Can we talk about the problems? Can we talk about the solutions? Can we talk about the highlights? Walk me through this. I haven't done this before, or it's been 6 months. What did we do last time? Can you look at that ticket? Can we actually go through this one more time? And when I go to place my order, Gary will go, hey, don't forget about this. Hey, you never ordered this last time. We ended up having to send that out at the last minute. And it's one of those things where, yeah, we're more used to framing. We're more used to, we always order 2x4s when we're building a wall. We might put different cladding on every single house. He's always there, and having that salesperson at the yard who's very familiar with it, that is a huge asset when it comes time to ordering that product, installing that product, and getting everything on site in an efficient way so that our team can actually move things forward as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible. And especially if you're going to special order something, if it's not in stock at the yard, if you're going to have to special order something, not only that salesperson that works for the parent company, but the local yard rep, that person, that team member is really crucial for my purchasing idea. If I go to the yard and nobody that works there has ever heard of the product, I'm real hesitant to be like, that might not be for us. That might be something that we would be like, maybe I might look at another yard because they might have that person, but I also might think twice about whether or not I want to delve into that if I haven't used it before. It's just barrier of entry, and that can be real challenging for me. It's not to say that I wouldn't use it. It's just one more step that is a challenge. While we're showing the Allura product in primed and not finished product, they offer it in pre-finished. Pre-finished in a lot of siding is a huge asset for us as well. Allura happens to make this in 25 different colors that come with a 15-year color warranty. 25 different colors is a lot, and that could be a huge asset to you. If you can get something in a pre-finished color, that pre-finished in a plant in a factory by really expensive equipment is a great thing because it's probably going to be a higher quality than what you can put on yourself in the sun and the heat with the dust. These guys happen to do Sherwin-Williams colors, so therefore if I wanted to paint my garage door to match something that they make, I can just go to Sherwin-Williams and pick up the color match, and now I can paint things to match. That's very convenient for me. Parts and pieces. We've talked at length both in the WRB episode and other episodes about systems approach. If I have trim pieces, if I have starters, if I have all the things that go together to make a systems approach where I'm not buying from dozens of different manufacturers to make something actually come together, where I have one family taking care of the whole cladding system, I'm going to lean towards that. The same thing would happen if I were looking at a brick. I wouldn't be looking for 4 different size bricks from 4 different manufacturers. I'd be looking for 1 brick from 1 manufacturer to do the whole house. It's those sorts of things that make the life of a contractor that much easier. I'm looking to simplify. I'm looking to make things a little bit easier. I'm looking for that systems approach. Also, I'm looking for familiarity. I'm looking for the ability to cut and nail and screw and fasten things in a way that my team, my carpenters, our subcontractors are familiar with. I'm not looking for every single time we go to the job site to have to stop and do a training with our team, or to have a new manufacturer's rep out to go, hey, I brought you a gun and a saw and this new dust thing, so that all these things that you've never worked with before, and I'm going to show you how to use them, and then I would rather there be some level of familiarity with a product so that I don't have to train people every single day of the week just to have some opportunity for success. I would rather there be a system in place with things that we've worked with before. I realize that's not always going to be the case. I realize we're expanding and we're learning, but I like familiarity. I like to be able to tell a client, hey, we've done this before. Let's go to this other job and look at how beautiful this can look. And that's part of our sales pitch, is that we are the experts. We have done it before. We do understand the product. And those are the things that make selling these things, because we do have to sell these to our clients at some level, that much easier. So understanding the risk of, we're trying to protect the building, we're trying to protect our enclosure, we're trying to make sure that we don't have any water held in tension, we're trying to provide drainage behind the cladding system, we're trying to understand that drainage and drying is probably a better system. We have to not forget that aesthetics are probably super important in this case, because we're looking at probably the single most aesthetic part of our building. This is what, 85% of what the clients are going to be able to see, as long as we don't count the grass. Like, this is a huge part of the building, and we have to take this into consideration, and we have to make sure that we're picking something that's considered. And from there, we really have to make sure that we're partnering with a company that is going to be around, is going to stand behind their product, and is going to make something that is going to last, because this is a lot to have to replace if we don't make wise choices at this point. So, thanks for watching today. Until next time, have a good day.